something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Salutations, good morning, and welcome. This is 103 FM WNHH, New Haven, the New Haven Independent gives us this hour together. It's wonderful. But anyway, get back. Salutations, New Haven. Salutations, Bridgeport. Salutations, all Connecticut in the world. We got a great show today. And today we'll be talking about, get this, democracy takes work. All right. And our guest is Rob Tabbitt from Bridgeport, and he'll introduce himself.
Hi, Harry. Jesse, I'm a pleasure to be here. Greetings from Bridgeport, Connecticut. And I came to Connecticut in 1971 from Los Angeles, California. I attended the LA City School District, one of our nation's largest and most underfunded districts, and ended up in Connecticut and have never left. And I have been working hard to try and change the system here in Connecticut, and started out working with juvenile delinquents in New Haven, and realized that they weren't a problem. The problem was our society was failing them, and my eyes opened as to how we needed to change that. And I realized that I didn't want to be a social worker. I became an organizer and spent 23 years of my life organizing, and then became a teacher here in Bridgeport, and spent more years, 20 years doing that. So overall, I've spent a lot of time teaching because I see organizing as teaching adults how to have political power, and it's all teaching. So I'm here today to talk about what I've learned in that time, and how we can apply those lessons to what we still need to do, because the fight's not over.
Fight's not over. And I think it's important for the public to understand that any elected official, while I may harass them at times, the truth is the work is hard. It countless more hours than what meetings, agendas they have are involved in doing that work. But Rob, let's think about, tell us about organizing. Tell us about where you started learning this thing. And Harry, I think we have an echo, just to let you know. So,
I, as I said, was working with the kids in New Haven, and as an undergraduate, I spent my time volunteering, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and I became a Vista volunteer. Spent a couple of years doing that, and I really enjoyed the work, but it was just, I felt like I was a Band-Aid. But in doing that, I started working with people in the hill section of New Haven, and people were doing urban homesteading and other interesting stuff. And there was a community organization there, and I ended up getting sent to a community organizing school. And I realized that organizing was a way of teaching people how to have power. And the beauty of our country is there's two ways to have power. You have a lot of money, or you have a lot of people. And if you have a lot of people, it doesn't mean anything unless you're organized and working together. And by organizing people to work together, you do have a chance of using that power to make change. But it takes a lot of work and a lot of time, and a lot of energy and a lot of courage. And that's the hard part of it. And you don't always win, but you keep fighting, and you can see story after story here in Connecticut and throughout the country of people who have done that and won. And so I started down that path and realized that's where I wanted to devote my life. I ended up in New Britain, your neck of the woods, working with the Connecticut Citizen Action Group, with some neighborhood groups and issue groups. And then I ended up with the Hotel and Restaurant Union doing union organizing, um, and with the AFT doing union organizing. But it organizing is labor intensive, um, and you go through struggles together with people. And I think I mentioned to you, I having been an army brat growing up, moving around from place to place every 6 months to 3 years. I sort of could never get the notion of old army buddies out of my mind. You go through a struggle together with people, and you never forget that. And whether it's a strike, an organizing drive, um, it is a deep commitment to each other, and that's what organizing is about. Um, but it's a lot of work, and you make a commitment to each other, and you see it together. And when you win, there's just nothing like it. And I've won some big fights in New Haven, in Willimantic, in Hartford, and in Bridgeport.
So, so you name four places. We're going to come to the Bridgeport story because that's historical. That's nationally historical. But you said you won some battles in Willimantic and Hartford
Yep,
and New Haven. Could
yep.
you tell us about those?
Well, when I left New Britain, I was hired by Hotel and Restaurant, and we were engaged in a number of fights. Hotel and Restaurant represented Western Mass, Southwestern Mass, Rhode Island, and all of Connecticut. So we had strikes in Providence, Hartford, and New Haven. But ostensibly, the main reason we were building for was to organize Local 34 at Yale. And that was an historic fight. It took us 3 years to get to an election, and then we had a strike for the first contract, and that was 5 years of work. And that was definitely historic. And if we hadn't done that, God knows what would have happened to the blue collar union at Yale, which I was a member of when I was a student. So it's that was an historic fight for the workers at Yale, on now the graduate students, and it changes the whole city of New Haven to have those workers organized. So that's one fight. In Willimantic, I was involved with organizing the hospital workers at Wyndham Hospital. We had AFT represented the nurses unions, but they realized they wanted to represent the rest of the workers in the hospital, and we organized all of the other bargaining units in that hospital and had to get involved in a very large community campaign to get the hospital to recognize us, because the hospital was going to engage in a fight to try and drag out the recognition, and we had to get involved in a large community fight, because they would have dragged it out for years denying recognition, and we ultimately forced them to give us the recognition that we deserved for winning that election. And that was a fight that took a couple of years. So again, another big important fight, and I'm still in touch with people from that campaign. This is 30 years ago. So you build those relations. You go through a war like that together, and you never lose those relations.
And, and
So
I
those are a couple of fights.
so
Um,
so graduate students, blue collar workers at a university, who we forget. Those are the people that keep the university, the lights on, the doors opening, the buildings running. I
Hospital
mean,
workers
yeah,
in
hospital
Wyndham.
workers, nurses, and then teachers and educators and kids. It seems you've been organizing for just about your whole life in this piece. It's an important, and I'd like the public to know that, because we will come to the Bridgeport moment. But our public schools, the feds spend about 80 to 100 billion a year. That's 10%. So you do that 10 times and you got $1 trillion a year. So why all these education reformers? Why do we have these calls? The reforms involve consolidating power, and I think if we listen, John F. Kennedy said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts completely. I'm wondering, why would we want to give mayors controls of appointing their school boards? But it was a big move in the 90s. It was a major push because what it's about, it's like colonizing. I want to colonize the public school budget, and Bridgeport is the biggest in the state. If I can colonize that, I hire the people I want, buy the products for my buddies. I no bids, all kinds of crazy stuff that goes on, but it's about money. And meanwhile, probably our children and our teachers are not being helped. So I get that. Now in Bridgeport, when Bridgeport came to my focus, because I was involved in the United to Save Our Schools, and all over the country we were hearing about um, com- actually, like they were, I think they were called the FER, Democrats for Education Reform, a group that was trying to uh, take over school boards and make them elected. I know in Hartford we had one, and sometimes on my show Robert Codal comes on. He was one of the elected
Yep.
members
Yep. I know,
for
Robert.
that place. But really, when we think about Bridgeport, Bridgeport is the Connecticut prize, the largest school budget, and if I can colonize that, oh my God. So could you tell us about that fight in Bridgeport, how it gets started? Because we were on a roll in Connecticut, Hartford, city after city, we were on a roll until the battle came to Bridgeport. And I thought Bridgeport, I said to myself, poor community. I don't think they're going to win this. I thought it was a done deal. And Robert, you guys proved me wrong.
Well, interestingly enough, the 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 everything looked right for them, and they had Mayor Finch, and Mayor Finch was definitely a friend of theirs. He believed in charter schools. He believed in what they were doing. Um, they have Bridgeport and New Haven have the largest concentration of charter schools in the state. We're both at about 15%. Um, they were they and as you know, just to go back a step on the history, we sort of had in this country uh, 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 there were these sort of public institutions that the wealthy sort of wanted to make money off of, and housing was the first industry, and then there was community health, hospitals, and now the last big institution that they wanted to sort of go after was education. And so here we see them coming into schools, and Bridgeport was where they were headed. But we saw, it all sort of germinate in New Haven, with Achievement First and um, uh, oh God, what was the name of Alex? And oh, his name eludes me. It'll come back to me. But they had moved into New Haven, Bridgeport, quite successfully, and were building strong in Bridgeport, and they had thought they were going to move quite well, and they took this daring move, at a time when Bridgeport's budget had bottomed out, and I'm afraid we're moving back in that direction with the current budget crisis. But they had. I sat at a meeting in 2011 where the Bridgeport Board of Ed and the superintendent Ramos, in the spring of that year, 2011, they basically said, "Listen, I'm afraid we don't have the money to, in good faith, say that we can educate the children of Bridgeport." And boy, they sprang on that. And they basically said, "Okay, well, you shouldn't be running the board of the city of Bridgeport." And that's when the state moved in quickly with the chair, Alan Taylor, who I remembered when I lived in Hartford, had been on the city council. And they moved to take over the Board of Ed, but they made one small mistake and skipped one step mandated by the law. And board member Maria Pereira and Bobby Simmons and their counsel took them to court on that, and they lost that case in the Supreme Court uh, because they had failed to follow the proper steps. And so the next year, the Supreme Court ruled, no, 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 you improperly took over the Board of Ed. And, I remember being at the Board of Ed meeting when Mayor Finch brought in Paul Vallis and introduced the savior, the savior of Bridgeport schools. Let me introduce to you Paul Vallis, and Paul Vallis is going to save us. And that was after we had this state appointed board which included people that didn't even live in the state of Connecticut, um, running the schools of Bridgeport. There was only one educator on the whole board. The rest were all business people. And uh, so we had this state appointed board, illegally state appointed board. Uh, Paul Vallis coming in to take over after his uh, service in I won't service as being generous. I know it after his tenure, I should say, tenure in New Orleans, Haiti, and Philadelphia. He came to Bridgeport to save us. And I remember watching him in meetings say to people, listen, I'm going to do things in such a way that I'm going to have it nailed down so tight that even if they get me out of here, they'll never be able to undo the damage I've done. Um, and So he came in and, uh, you know, Maria and Norm Pattis, their attorney, were able to undo that damage through the Supreme Court, and they already had their backup plan in motion, which was the charter change proposal, which would allow the mayor to appoint all 9 members of the Board of Ed. And that charter change proposal was all set to go and be on the ballot the next fall. And They had it set, and the political machine in Bridgeport is powerful. There was a political miscalculation by Finch and his Democratic town chair, John Staffstrom, because the political machine was not as strong as it had been. And that was a miscalculation on their part. And their part, I include the wealthy people that were backing them, thought that they could just steamroll us. So I was brought into a meeting. I was on the CEA board at the time as the vice president of the BEA. I was brought into a meeting with my local president and the political director of CEA and the executive director of CEA. And they said, listen, if we give you $150,000, can you mount a credible campaign in Bridgeport? And they were planning on trying to show Governor Malloy that we had enough power in Bridgeport that he should worry, as the governor, that the Democratic Town Committee didn't control Bridgeport. And I said, yeah, oh, absolutely, we can run a credible campaign. And the money was $100,000 from CEA and $50,000 from the AFT. We were given resources, staff from CEA or staff from AFT, Working Family Party, CCAG, and other unions. And we pulled together the crew. But the basic core crew was a crew of people that had been working together since the 90s, that had come together when the Democratic Town Committee had refused to endorse a progressive state rep who had been in office for 3 or 4 terms. And that crew had been working together ever since. We had run a slate for the Board of Ed, won at the polls, and got cheated out of it by absentee ballot corruption in Bridgeport, and had been working together for years. And that is really the key to organizing. A group that had been working together for years, built relationships for years, trusted each other, worked together, and that crew came together with the help of all the other organizations I just mentioned. That was the foundation that we built on. And so when I assuredly said to the executive director of CEA, sure we can, I knew we had that foundation to build on. And with all the other resources that they gave us and the money, I knew we could build a campaign. And we didn't just build a campaign, we won.
And outspent.
We were outspent
8-1.
8-1. They spent close to $1 million, and we actually spent a little less than 150,000. But we had the people. And we didn't argue with them about educational policy. We argued with them about civil rights. We made a tactical decision, strategic decision that taking away people's right to vote was an issue that would resonate, and it did. Taking civil rights in a city like Bridgeport, people got behind that. We had people out door knocking. We had people out doing all the hard work that organizing takes. And people were doing it with heart. People were fighting with heart, making the phone calls in the office every night. We had a storefront in the east end of Bridgeport, and you could just see the activity in the office. People could look through the storefront and see us every day. People going and coming in and out, in and out. It was a beehive of activity. Whereas they actually had the nerve to rent an empty bank office next door, and there were maybe 3 or 4 people sitting in that bank office doing nothing. So the juxtaposition of their office and our office was the height of irony. But we had people from all across the city. And that was what had come together in the 90s. I mean, the group that came together in the 90s was, former leaders of the Young Lords in Bridgeport. A guy who's now was the head of the Board of Ed back then, but is now a judge in Danbury. Ed Gomes, a former state senator in Bridgeport. Just people who represented all different parts of the community, and had come together and been fighting together for years. I go back to the old Army buddies, people who had been in many fights together and trusted each other and knew each other. And that's what organizing does, is you build those bonds, and those bonds mean something.
And so beat the powerful machine, the mayor, the governor, the Department of Education, the Connecticut Department of Education was fully involved in the fight to take away that elected school board.
Absolutely. You can beat them all because you have the power of the vote in this particular case. In other cases, you have the power of the people. I've been in fights where you turn out 500 or 600 people and that does it. I've been in cases where you strike and that does it. You deny your labor, that does it. So it depends on what their leverage is that you need to do. In this case, it was the power of the vote. And we did it. And it was a trick. They tried everything. I mean, the question they put on the ballot was designed for you to automatically say yes. And so our whole campaign was vote no, vote no.
And it was always, you mentioned Paul Vallis. Paul Vallis is famous with Arnie Duncan, with also Race to the Top, No Child Left Behind. He was the fixer that would come in and fix everything. We have to ask ourselves something, because we've been pushing these kinds of reforms. I'm not saying just take away the elected school board, curricular, miracle curriculums that will make everyone a reader, a math genius, and all these things. We see this. But one of the things that I've been looking at lately with my friend, Dr. Robert Cotto at Trinity, is we've been looking at what has been happening. We've spent now nearly maybe $2.5 trillion on school reform since 2002 in America. That's federal money. So we got to remember that you got to do that 10 times that to get the whole total in that sense. But we've spent this money saying that we're going to improve, in the name of equity, we've spent it saying that we're going to improve the schools of where Black and brown children go, where poor children go, urban and rural. And when we look at what we've got for that, our current high schoolers scored lower than the high school students in 2001 and 2002. So before we done the reforms, and the other thing we looked at is what's happened to those schools? Where are the school librarians? Where are the reading specialists? Where are the special education teachers? Where are the music teachers? Where are the art teachers? Where are the clubs? Where are the extra school activities? Because these reforms rob the budget. That's what they do. And so, but could you tell us about, it's not only an elected school board, but the fight to bring equity, because you phrased it. You said we didn't really go with the normal fight. We went with a civil rights approach. So what is the civil rights battle in our urban schools today? What is it like, and what are we fighting for?
We made a choice as to how to couch that question to win that vote. I could not agree with you more about the equity issue that we're looking at in Connecticut, and I think nationally, which is we have an issue of not wanting to spend the money to educate. I think it was Danton, one of the leaders. I was a French history major in college. I studied in Paris for a year. Danton, one of the leaders of the French Revolution, said, "After bread, education is the most important need of the people." And it, they don't want to educate our people. They would rather see our people come out uneducated, and our children deserve the same educational opportunities as every other child in this state. And it was one of my great ironies while sitting on the CEA board that I would fight with the CEA leadership, because we had our members in the wealthier districts crying about the problems of education reform, No Child Left Behind, and then putting Race to the Top, putting it on steroids. The how appallingly difficult all this testing and all that stuff. But the fact is, we were wasting all this money on testing when we should have been putting this money into teaching. And it was oppressing the teachers, and they were complaining about the testing and the assessments of teachers, when in fact they should have been standing up with us in the poor districts saying this is appalling. And so you're right that the civil rights of our students are being ignored, because our students deserve the same high quality education as the students in all of the other districts in this state. And so I think my colleague Joe Sokolovic has lately been on a tear about the tale of two Connecticuts, which has been a phrase we've been using in this state longer than he's lived here. But that's the truth in Connecticut. We have a tale of two Connecticuts, and we always have. We have the poor Connecticut and we have the wealthy Connecticut, and the poor Connecticut has been neglected. And that's what I learned in the early 70s when I moved here, is how dramatically that is. And, when I lived in Los Angeles, it's this huge megalopolis, and it's not as apparent. But when you come to a tiny little state like Connecticut, it's clear as a bell. We had New Haven, Hartford, and Bridgeport, three of the poorest cities per capita in the United States, right next door to some of the wealthiest communities in the United States. So you just couldn't have seen it any more clearly and starkly how this is. And then, as we've been talking about lately, some of the poorer rural areas that just get lost in the woods. But it's the cities and these poor communities that, are being underfunded terribly. And it's not just schools, but for us, for you, and for me, our passion has been education. As we look at in Connecticut for All, it's also other issues like affordable housing and healthcare and other issues that we need to look at too. But the underfunding in education is just a tragedy, and our children are just as capable of performing at a high level. Connecticut schools, if you took out, and I don't agree that testing is a proper measure of educational success. Let's preface this by saying I do not believe test scores measure educational success. But if you took those poor districts out, Connecticut schools are on par with Finland and Singapore and the rest of the schools in the world. There's nothing wrong with our school systems. What's wrong is that we're not putting the resources into our poor communities so that our children in the poor communities can succeed as well as the children in our wealthy communities. Our children are just as capable in our poor communities. They're just not being provided the resources. And as Jonathan Kozol said so properly so many years ago, we do it backwards. We put more resources in the communities that need it the least and less resources in the communities that need it the most. So if we just put the resources into the communities like Hartford and New Haven and Bridgeport and the other poor communities, I don't mean to leave them out, we would see our children blossom as they can.
So,
with proper teaching,
yeah, yeah.
not test oriented teaching,
So,
proper teaching.
so for I interview lots of education experts and warriors on the show here, and I remind people I have a Facebook group called Children Are More Than Test Scores, and really what it's about when I watch these reforms come into play. You and I are of age that yes, we had standardized testing when we were kids, but over the course, we were tested once in the third grade, the sixth grade, and the ninth grade. Never, no school ever spent more than a day or two. So we lost 6 days of learning. In 2010, I walked to DC because a mother called me. A mother called me and said, Dr. Turner, my son Eddie got in trouble today at school. And so we were talking, and I'm like wondering, well, where do I know you from? And we had a literacy center that provided free tutoring. And Eddie was one of the kids that we couldn't get in because we didn't have enough tutors. And so I said, oh, we'll get him in next time. And I said, what happened today that you're this upset about to call me? And she said, Eddie got into a fight. And so Eddie was a second grader, and they had a parent room where in those days the data walls were going up, and some smart administrator, I'm joking, of course, being facetious on this, decided they would put up images of the houses of the three little pigs. And every student's name was somewhere. You're in the brick house, the sticks. And Eddie and his friend, I forget what his friend's name was, but they used to he had to go to the bathroom. And though a second grader, you needed to go with a friend. So the teacher sent them to the bathroom. But of course, like second graders, they wandered into the parent resource room. And so they looked around, and I forget what the other young man's name was, but he turned around to his best friend and he said, Eddie, you're the stupidest kid in the school. And instantly it went into a fight. They started punching each other, screaming, and everybody came in. You know how it is in an elementary school. You're an elementary teacher.
I'm
And
an
his mother,
elementary teacher.
yeah. And his mother said, Eddie's not violent. They told me he's got a problem. He's violent and all this. And she said, what's got a problem is what they're doing with literacy, reading. He used to love to be read to. We read every night. Reading was fun. Now he hates reading, you know. And so she said, what about literacy? And so that was the conversation that spurred my 400-mile walk to DC against this. But also the time that I looked at, I had to look at what was happening. I said, you and I had 3 to 6 days we lost learning. Well, the current assessment system takes 6 to 8 weeks away from learning. And if you add that up over 13 years, that's nearly 3 years loss of learning. I say we should be looking at that. How many times you put a chicken on the scale doesn't make it any fatter. You have to feed that chicken. But anyway, sorry, I went on the tangent, but I want the public to know.
I should point out to you that I got interviewed this fall by one of the community groups about endorsing me. And one of them says to me, what about social studies? Why don't we have a director of social studies? And I said, well, I think the answer is rather obvious. Can't you see it? And they said, what do you mean? And I said, we don't test for social studies. And they looked at me and they said, what? And I said, we don't do a standardized test for social studies. So it's not a priority.
And at a time.
And they looked at me and they said, that's it? And I said, yeah. I said, I taught social studies in my class in 4th and 5th grade. I said, I wove it into, I was told, weave it into your language arts teaching. But I raised, I taught civics during election time. I taught civil rights during, Black History Month, and from Martin Luther King's birthday through Black History Month. I said, I taught all those things, but, there was no, social studies curriculum. There was just weave it in. There's no social studies director. I said, it's not a standardized testing. And that's the sickness of what standardized testing does to us.
Yeah, no, that's precisely. And I would even argue to say this is intentional. Because that social studies is getting covered in Farmington, in Avon, in Westport, in Stamford, in our affluent communities. They have the time to do this, and they invest in that civics stuff. And I've watched in my urban schools has just disappeared, because now we have 90 minutes of reading, we have 90 minutes of writing, we have 90 minutes of math. Well, that's the school day when you take away lunch, and PE, if you're lucky to have PE, because
And
it's led
and,
to, in my
and we
opinion.
and we cover it too because we are concerned about certain social studies. We do have it in the high school level, but in the elementary level, it was not. We were not, as guided, and it needs to be corrected. And I'm just that my point is that we're not, as you said, we're not teaching the way we should be teaching. We're focused on the testing. Everything is
Let me,
focused on everything is focused on teaching to the test. It's not focused on what we should be focused on. And that's where, when I get asked the question, if you had all the money you needed, what would you do? And I say smaller class size so that the classroom teacher can spend more time with each student. And then I would have additional money for academic interventionists and social interventionists so that our students can get the help they need when we identify it. Because right now, when we identify a child in need, we kick the can down the road. We don't deal with it. And we need to do it right away. And I tell the story of the Mandels, who were notorious for their pseudo charity work, and more notorious for people like you and me that know better for their pro-charter, pro-privatization work. And they were deeply involved in this whole state takeover. I mean, Bridgeport takeover thing that you're talking about. Megan Lowney, their executive director, was tied in with Alan Taylor in communications in that court case that Maria and her lawyer presented to the Supreme Court. Alan Taylor was communicating with her. But they had an award called the Lone Pine Award. My school finished second one year, and everybody in the school gets a check for a certain amount of money. And the first place school was one in Stratford. And I had a Title I tutor that worked at both schools. And she said to me, our school of 1,200 students, which had one and a half to two literacy coaches at the time, their school, which was a quarter of the size, had 3 literacy coaches and 3 literacy tutors.
yes.
And it's just there's no magic to this. And Stratford is still a poor working class community, so it's not one of the wealthy Gold Coast communities. It just gives you an example of what you would do, and we identify problems and we can't deal with them. And the ability to and I would talk about a colleague who was a kindergarten teacher at Cesar Batalla in Bridgeport. And when she moved to Trumbull from Iowa, her child was immediately identified with a problem and it was dealt with. And her
Yeah.
child is now a 40-something-year-old successful businesswoman. And our Uniserv rep, our business agent, our union staff person, lived in Litchfield. And when his son was identified slipping behind in high school in both language arts and math, he was given interventions immediately. And within months, he was back up on where he needed to be.
So,
And we can't do that. We don't have the ability to take those actions immediately when they need to be taken, when the student is identified, whether it's at the elementary level or in the high school level. And that's what we need to be able to do.
and so,
And then you
okay.
get the money and you add the enhancements, the extracurricular courses, the electives, the other things that make education even more fun, the history, the arts, the other stuff.
And
So
we should. I also like the public to understand something. We like to blame teachers, even administrators. We like to blame them, but they don't pick the curriculums. They don't pick what gets taught in priority and poor school districts. The state is dictating. Right now we dictate one of 5 reading curriculums for priority school districts. If I remember right, NYU designated two of them racially offensive and another on the borderline. And they're part of our five golden programs. But teachers don't pick this. So the idea, when I look at it, reformers love to blame teachers, love to blame districts. But what we're really talking about is a system that spends more money on its wealthy schools than its poor schools, is comfortable with that in there, and then put mandates and requirements on poor schools that force them to get rid of music teachers, art teachers, librarians, because these data tracking systems, power schools, they're expensive. The curriculums they buy are expensive. And so we start losing some of those things that you call the academics and the motivational kinds of things that go on. So I think now we painted such a dark picture, Robert. We got to talk about hope. And I know we said democracy takes work.
I want to add one other thing there, Jesse. I want to add one other compliment. People talk about our teachers, but they forget our teachers are making in the neighborhood of $20,000 to $25,000 a year less than the teachers in the districts around us, and they stay here. Now, if that and they're working in conditions substantially worse than the conditions they could be working in a neighboring district. So, if that's not commitment to the children of our district, I don't know what is. And so I just can't speak more highly of the teachers that work in our district. And people forget that many of them grew up in Bridgeport before they became teachers. So our teachers are extraordinarily committed to the children of our district and work for the love of our children. And it goes right to your retirement. I mean, we are again going to try in this legislative session. When a teacher retires from Bridgeport, you're getting a lower pension for the rest of your life too. So you're not doing yourself any favor to work in Bridgeport, other than you love working in Bridgeport and the children of the city. So you're right. Let's look at where we're going. I think that we are at a time where, for the last few years, it started with Recovery for All, now called Connecticut for All. But we have been working, people throughout the state on trying to change this value. And I have never seen a time with more hope in all the time that I've been working in this state for this issue. Because the state, for when you took your walk, the state was struggling to pull itself out of the economic downturn. And Connecticut, worse than most other states, couldn't seem to drag itself out of the hole it fell into, and was struggled for many, many years to recover from the economic downturn. But Connecticut has recovered nicely from the economic downturn of the COVID crisis. And as the stock market soars, so does Connecticut's revenue. And we are looking now at approximately $6 billion surplus. The wealthy residents of Connecticut have been making money hand over fist for the last few years as the stock market soars. The governor refuses to consider a wealth tax, which wealthy people don't pay taxes at the same rate as us working folks. And that's just not fair. They should be paying taxes at the same rate as working people. And if they did, Massachusetts passed a wealth tax a few years ago, and they are bringing in another $2 to $3 billion a year in revenue in that state. So if we were able to dip into the surplus, and use $2 to $3 billion to fix the myriad problems, not just education, but the other ones we talked about a moment ago, we could fix a lot of these problems, including the schools. And in the short term, that would be a short-term fix, economic fix. And then in the long term, if you passed a wealth tax, that would give you a sustainable revenue source in the long term. And we could begin to address this tale of two states that has existed in this state for the 50 years I've lived here. Um, and that's really what we have. And we have a core group of people who have been working together in schools. I know Leslie Blateau, the president of the New Haven Federation of Teachers, has been leading the charge for the schools. There are excellent people. The new chair of the Hartford Board of Education, I met at the CABE conference last week, and she's great. And I know there's good people in New Britain and Stamford, in Danbury. So I think there are folks all across the state. Then there are the unions have both bought in. So I think that we can really begin to pull together this coalition of educators, educational people, and there are other unions working on the other issues. I know my wife has been working with people on affordable housing issues. So I just think there are people working on all these issues that we can begin to pull together, um, to try and address the injustice that exists in our state. And so it's going to take a lot of work. As we said at the beginning, democracy takes work,
Work
but
that's worth doing. This is the work
the
of
prize
justice.
is there.
Right. This is the stuff. People are. Someone once told me that poverty makes money. It makes a lot of money. Let's keep the. We have entities in the country who are profiting off poverty and want to seek to profit more off that stuff. So we've got this piece. We got a $6 billion budget. My wife was a Harvard school teacher for 25 years. She watched during this time as she was in a middle school, a 6 to 8 middle school, and they had an art teacher, a music teacher. They had 3 PE teachers. And when we look at this thing, she watched over the years as the art teacher left. I mean, not left, was cut. The music teachers, the librarian, 2 of the PE teachers, a school counselor. They had a school counselor and social worker for every grade, a VP for every. They all were gone, and then they wondered. And she said, "Of course, our kids. They reacted. They went insane. Their behavior went up, and she saw all that. But also, 25 years, my wife, very simple. If the state controls the teacher pensions, why not do the healthcare? My healthcare, I have cancer, Rob, and when I see the bills that are coming through, they're literally hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I'm not paying anything, Rob, but my wife has to be under my health insurance because her health insurance as a Harvard teacher after 25 years was $15,000 a year. So we could make a fix. I'm going to make a suggestion that if Ed Lamont wants to win the teachers' votes, tell you what, I'm sure Leslie Bluto will be happy. Let's give the teachers the same pension that state workers and legislators and the governor has. That's one way. I'd like that. That's my one little solution today. That let's give them a pension, where they don't have to spend $10,000 to $15,000 a year, in Obamacare to try to get covered for things that I think they should be covered for.
Well, he had the audacity when he came down to Bridgeport last winter, spring, to meet with teachers. He and the commissioner, and the deputy commissioner, they came down to meet with the panel of teachers, most of whom were my friends from when I was president of the union down here. And I was in attendance. And afterwards, we were chatting, him and myself and a couple other teachers. And he said to me, if you weren't doing this and that, and I said, Governor, I don't think you understand. We're the ones that made all those changes before the state stepped in. We took over the board, we ousted the previous chair and the superintendent, and we made those changes before the state took over. Oh, well, that's good. And I said, furthermore, when you tell me that money doesn't fix all the problems, it's real easy for a rich man like yourself to tell me that, but we'd sure like to find out for ourselves. And that's really the problem, because we have the same number of administrators as his town of Greenwich. And yet we're the biggest district in the state. So he's criticizing us for having too many administrators, yet we have no more administrators than his tiny little district of Greenwich. So he's got some nerve. So the level of ignorance and the level of political posturing by him is baloney. I could use another word, but we're on air.
Oh, no, but this,
That's what bothers me. Is it's easy for the rich man to tell us this stuff, but the rich man is protecting his rich friends. And as you pointed out correctly, that's one of the factors in this next year. What we've seen is last legislative session, they bent those guardrails. They used these guardrails that were set up to protect wealthy people that require a 60% vote. To increase the taxes for working people like you and me, it requires a simple majority. To increase the taxes on wealthy people, it requires a supermajority of 60%. Well, isn't that nice? They get special rules. But the fact is, they bent those guardrails in the last legislative session twice. So they are bendable. And they bent them again in the special session a few weeks ago to spend $500 million. $500 million to deal with the SNAP and other issues. So they showed that where there's a will, they can do it. So now we have to give them the reason to spend it for these issues that we care about. And that's what we need to organize around, is to give them the reason. Now, as you just correctly pointed out, it's an election year. The governor's running for office, all the legislators are running for office, and we have to remind them of the importance of dealing with these issues for us and the number of people that it affects and the number of people that care about these issues. Whether it's housing or education or healthcare or whatever the issue is, there are an awful lot of people that care about these issues. And we need to get those people to remind those people running for office that we care about those issues. And if they don't address those issues, they're not going to get our votes.
So let's, because we're sort of in our
We're getting in the
at
end,
this
right?
time. But if I thought of the things that unions and communities and parents should be fighting for, I would be fighting for to have the same amount of librarians that Greenwich has, that Darien has, the same amount of literacy coaches and interventionists and special ed teachers and counselors, and I would be fighting for a different way, not necessarily more funding. I'm tired of fighting for reform scams, curricular reform scams. I want to fight for those resources you talked about, the after-school programs, the art programs, the summer programs, the music, the librarians, the whole stuff. Hartford has, I think, I can't, roughly somewhere around 45, maybe 48 schools. They used to have a librarian at every one of those schools. I think there's less than 8 of them left now. So is this a good, if we're going to look for hope, should we be fighting a different kind of equity battle politically when we organize?
Well, I'll give you two ways of looking at that. I know you like the staffing one. I like that. Before we brought in the previous superintendent that we just changed a year ago, we had moved to do what New Haven did, which is to set up an ideal staffing. And she canned that immediately when she came in. And so we're going to move to go back to that level so that we can look at it. Bridgeport has no librarians right now. Our art teachers have not had an increase in their supply money in over 15 years. So they're living off of scraps of paper and supplies. So we have lots of problems like that you're talking about. I remember having a discussion with the state senator from Bloomfield about this, McCrory, at a session a couple of years ago. And I said to him, look, I remember, Senator, when you were still teaching in Hartford, we used to have a para not only in every kindergarten, we have none we had none in Bridgeport for a while. We used to have paras in every Hartford first grade and second grade. I remember when I worked for AFT, I had an arbitration for second grade paras. So that's all changed, and that's the kind of thing we should go back to. But I think staffing is one good way of looking at it. I like that approach. But I also know that we haven't increased the ECS formula in over 13 years, and that needs to be fixed, as well as the formulas within it for multi-language learners, for poverty level, and for SPED. They took care of the SPED last year, but that was because SPED affects every district in the state. It's not just a poor district issue. Don't worry about the multi-language learner or the poverty issue because that only affects the poor districts. That's where they bent the guardrails last spring, was for SPED. They didn't do it for multi-language learners or poverty, and they haven't fixed the base formula in over 13 years. So that needs to be fixed in education, because that's the basic formula for taking care of the inequity.
All right. So we
So
have a battle.
those are issues that we need to go for.
Let's do it. Let's have an equity summit. Let's do it in Bridgeport. Let's organize the fighters. This is your host, Dr. Jesse P. Turner, on the Readman, Truth to Power Hour on 103.5 New Haven. And I want to tell people, love, peace, read, listen, speak truth, and guess what? Organize and vote. I love you people. And thank you, Rob, for being a guest on our show. High praise.
Thank you for having me.
For fighting the battle of battles. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.